Shri Guru Vishnu Guru Parampara ki jai. Chaitanya Charitamrita ki jai. Kartik Sat ki jai. Gaur Bhaktivinoda ki jai. Gaur Premanande. So tonight we come to the end of the chapter, the seventh chapter of Adi-lila. Mahaprabhu was now converted to sannyasis of Varanasi, Benares. And so Chandrasekhar Tapanamisha Arsanatan Sunideki Anandita Savakaran. So he's reunited again with Chandrasekhar, Tapanamisha and Sanatana Swami. Tapanamisha, as we know, has been sent to Benares by Caitanya Mahaprabhu for seemingly no reason. Chandrasekhar was there. Whatever reasons we don't know, but they were, of course, they associated with one another, and when Mahaprabhu appeared there as a sannyasi, he lived with Chandrasekhar and took his meals at the house of Tapanamisha, who was also the father of Raghunath Swami. And so they were his hosts, and Sanatana Swami was visiting, and having left the government service and so forth, and met with Caitanya Mahaprabhu there. And together they were not pleased with the way in which Caitanya Mahaprabhu was perceived by the leading people, spiritual leaders of the community. And as we know, having heard the narrative, his heart couldn't stand that and made an arrangement to be invited to get accompany the spiritual leaders, the Mayavadins, where he would avoid our narrative, conclude lunch in their company, which he wouldn't do previously. To eat with someone that was thought to be intimate and a time of sharing intimately. You can share intimately with them due to their different, very different perspectives. One of which, that of the Mayavadins, was thought to be offensive to the ideal of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, entering as it did the form of Bhagavan, his Lila, Nam, and so forth, to the Sattva-guna, rather than understanding that it's transcendent and so forth. So here he ends with taking their lunch. We were at class lunch with them, and he's reunited now with Chandrasekhar's host Tapanamisha, and Sanatana is there, and they are Sunideki Anandita Sabakara. Seeing his victory, hearing about it, it took great joy. So Vaishnava Toshani has been accomplished. The Vaishnavas have been pleased. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has done this all for their pleasure. Prabhu ke dekhi the aishe shakala sannyasi Prabhu prashamsa kore sab varnasi. Many Mayavadi sannyasis in Varanasi came to see the Lord after this incident, the conversion of Prabhupada, and in fact the whole city came to praise him, celebrate his presence and so forth. So it's somewhat analogous to the idea that if you conquer the king becomes a Catholic, so does everybody else. In the kingdom, you have the leaders of Varanasi, and the Brahminical and spiritual point of view, highly regarded sannyasins, and with their conversion, then everyone followed. Varanasi Puri Adi-lila Shri Krishna Caitanya Puri Sahasa Valoka Vila Mahadanya. Shri Krishna Chaitanya visited throughout the city of Varanasi, And all the people were very grateful to have his company. Lak chalak chalok Abhishek Prabhu Gedeki the. Mahabidha Huvavare Nai Prabhushite. Many thousands of people came to see Prabhu, and at his door, they gathered there. Too many, yes, to enter. Prabhu Jali Jana Vaishnava Vishveshwar Darshan Yaksha Prabhu Ashi Nile Seistane. When Prabhu went to visit the temple of Vishveshwar, hundreds of thousands of people assembled to see him. Snan Kurite Jave Jana Gongati Ahani Sakala Loka Hui Mahabhi. When we went to the bank of the Ganges to bathe, crowds, thousands of people followed him in single flow. Bahuture Prabhu Bole, Bola Hari Hari, Haridwani Kori Loka, Swarga Marcha Bhari. Wherever the crowds were too great, Mahaprabhu stood up and raised his hands, chanted Hari Hari, to which the people who had assembled responded, filling the land and the sky with the Haridwani sound of Hari. Lokamishta Prabhu Chalite Harilaman Vrindavane Pratha Sri Sanatana. After delivering the people in general, and Lord desired to leave Varanasi, and after instructing Sanatana, he sent him to Vrindavan. Ratri Divase Loke Shuni Lokolahal Varanasi Kali Prabhu Varanilacha. Because the city of Varanasi was full of large crowds, many people, roughly like the quiet, as it's gone to Vrindavan, passed through the jungle and lived there. It's described later on how much he enjoyed the life of a sannyasi. He enjoyed solitude and self-reliance, reliance on Bhagwan and so forth in the forest. So, too many people there. So after sending Sanatana to Vrindavan, he returned to the government of Puri. Adi-lila Koriva Adi Vishtar Koriva Sanchepe Kavilan Iham Prasanga Koriva. I've given thus as a brief account for these pastimes, but later I shall describe them more extensively. So this comes then at the end of the Adi-lila, where this narrative, this lila, falls in chronological order. Here, as we've several times mentioned, it's out of chronological order, and we've surmised the purpose of it being here is that, as an afterthought, having written extensively on the philosophy and theology of early Vaishnavism, we want to point out what it's not, which was the popular spiritual idea at the time. The Advaita Vedanta, Advaitins were the spiritual, the liberated people for gods, and then the religious sector of the Advaitin, which the Smartas. They had a monopoly on religion. So they didn't do anything which religious culture, get married, or anything, whatever, for them. And the idea, popular idea, seemed like the dominant idea was that, as per Vedanta, you could take birth as a Brahmin, and then in that birth, or one such birth, to take sannyas, you could get liberated. There was a bit of a bhakti revolt to this, which seemed to distance God from the people. And Chaitanya was the leader of that revolt. It also manifests in other ways through the work of of Guru Nanak, contemporary of Mahaprabhu, the Tukram, Kabir, yeah, well, they're all emphasis on Nam. Most of them, all, not Tukram, but most of them, emphasis on the idea of a Sagunam, a Nam that is Satvaguna, so it's kind of a bhakti version of a Vedanta where you do bhakti. Bhakti, the idea is that you read it. It's similar to Buddhism, that we have the nine, eightfold path,
Eight Noble Truths.
Eight Noble Truths that constitute like living a moral life, your yama and yama, to use the yogic terminology. And this type of moral life is thought to have a value that the sattvic life, the life of virtue, because it's anchored to the transcendental reality. And so because it serves as a bridge, the sattva-guna, the life of virtue, by way of clear thinking that ultimately culminates in the ability to discriminate between consciousness and matter. Of course, it's not there for the Buddhists, but they do discriminate enough to understand that attachment to matter is, of course, is a source of suffering. And we have some idea of nirvana and the subject of consciousness. They speak mostly of consciousness in terms of perception and how that is a passing thing. Anyway, as we've already explained, the Mayavad, Advaita Vedanta, and Buddhism are pretty much the same. We really look at it, and that's how it's looked at in contemporary society to a large extent, contemporary spiritual circles of the West. Although they were at the time very much arguing with one another over largely over the Veda as the Praman, whether or not the Veda is the Praman or not, evidence or not, whether it's unauthored sounds or whatnot. Anyway, Buddhist emphasis was away from that, as much as the Vedas were largely deal with material life and lawful acquisition and so forth. And that has nothing to do ultimately with the spiritual life. But again, the life of virtue is advocated there. Ultimately, Dharma and Buddha had the Eightfold Path and so forth, and Mayavadis have this emphasis on virtue, and we do as well. And as much as the virtue serves Sattva-guna as a bridge, ultimately, to see our way into the necessity for transrational type of exercise, that we can enter into the real good, the ultimate good. So the moral good, the moral virtue, the sattva-guna it is a partial good, so to speak. It's a reflection of the good, partial manifestation of the absolute good, the world of absolute good. And we can see it. It's partial because it's always in flux, and morality is such a complex subject. To arrive at an ultimate good, a moral conclusion, is very, very difficult. If you take a class on moral, for the nature of morality, there are these perplexing, I haven't done it, but I know about perplexing moral issues and what's right. And try as you might, it's got to come up with a conclusive position. People will take one position and realize they are due to psychological condition, their psychology and so forth. But how to arrive at an absolute, maybe on some issues, but that can change also with time, circumstance, and so forth. So the moral good, the virtue, it's sattva. Sattva reveals the Atma, the self, in its optimum, which, in relation to which understanding, realizing the moral life is left behind. That's not to become liberated.
It's not that the Swami makes the point in his commentary on his own Tripurari. It is possible to arrive at self-realization, Atma, Atma-gyan, Atmananda, Atmaram without bhakti, but it's a trifling thing. And he says, it's a small thing. It's not Brahman realization. There's a difference between Atma and Brahman. Big difference, even though they're very similar in nature, constitution, so forth. So at any rate, virtue is thought to have real and tangible value because it is the bridge to transcendence where ultimate value is found, ultimate reality, ultimate good, ultimate in ethics and aesthetics, good and beauty. Otherwise, what makes it any better than the Rajaguna and Tamaguna perspectives? So you find in these really transcendental paths well thought out, around for a long time, and it then produced results that there will be the emphasis called the Eightfold Path, Yama Niyama, Vaidhi, Maryada, the different names for it, so forth, Dharma. And this is a good point, really, that is people in the modern day, there's this, especially in the West, land of packaging and entrepreneurs and making everything better, changing, making it better, to quandary to define the spiritual and so forth. And just to me, it just flies in the face of so many examples. I mean, the Buddha, the Jesus, the Rumi, the Mahaprabhu, of course, the Swamis, these people aren't spiritual. And what it is, that they were wrong. And of course, they emphasized the moral life as a kind of a ground. We often emphasize that Vaishnavism transcends the moral life of the Varnashram and so forth. But that doesn't mean that Bhakti doesn't have its own rules and regulations and so forth. It does. And so, if you are a devotee, you're going to be a moral person. It goes without saying. So when they say steps in the head of Varnashram, sometimes devotees become upset as if we're advocating something type of just steal for Krishna or whatever. But no, there might be some extreme incidents, and then those examples are given just to make the point. But the overarching point, I guess, as well, is that a devotee of Krishna will be a morally stout person. And we can apply this Vaidhi Bhakti kind of sensibilities there. Vaidhi Bhakti is different, of course, than Rag Bhakti, and Vaidhi Bhakti unto itself as a path leads elsewhere than Rag Bhakti does. But it doesn't mean that Vaidhi Bhakti has nothing to do with Rag Bhakti. Indeed, Vaidhi Bhakti is the following of Vaidhi Bhakti is one of the three things that Rupa Goswami says makes up the actual practice of Rag Bhakti. Remembering the Leelas of Krishna, serving in a sadhakadeya and a siddhadeya, and practicing Vaidhi Bhakti. Especially here in chanting, smart meditation, and so forth. So it serves as a support. Jiva Goswami makes this point about Sambhava. We adopt Raga practice as much as we can, mixing them with the support from Vaidhi Bhakti. Until the taste becomes prominent and it's driven by that alone. Which is the full idea of eligibility for Raga Bhakti. So, anyway, yeah, so there's this it's an interesting idea of the moral life as opposed to the spiritual life, how they fit together, and where one falls off. And the other picks up and the one helps the other and support it and so on and so forth. Not sure how we got onto that here, but he said here in the last verse we read that I've given a brief account of these pastimes. Later I'll describe them in an extensive way. So he's just saying why what the chronological order is and how this is appearing out of chronological order and making certain points to us. Somehow we got off onto that interesting tangent. Even if we're not connecting it back to the main stream, which we're entering in now from another side. Stream of the narrative of Adi-lila. So a little out of place, but very much in place because he wants to emphasize what the philosophy, theology that he's just described at length is not. And and that was this stream. That was the dominant thinking of the time. This Mayavad, to which there was a revolution, so to speak. And I've named a few of the people, the luminaries, the Guru Nanak, and you see their book is all about Net Ram, Krishna Nam, Satnam, Satnam, over and over again, that's the emphasis. Kabir, as we said, Tukram and others. I see that maybe he was later, but anyway, so many. Most of them, this is the point we're making, their emphasis on Nam is on Savun Nam, not Nirgun Nam. Mahaprabhu's, he has a Nam Dharma, really, that if you study it, you see that he is really into the name, because the name is not something for him that's left behind. So, whereas the Sagunanam is chanted with the idea of it reaching its efficacy and when it becomes liberated and the name is left behind. So it's a kind of a mixing bhakti into the Advaita Vedanta idea, bhakti for mukti. Vishnu Chakravarti calls this sattviki bhakti. Bhakti takes a form. They say bhakti is sattva, but she takes a form of sattva. Although she's transcendent, she appears in the mode of goodness and gives the power for those who apply themselves with such bhakti to attain their ideal, not the Advaitin ideal, because it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. The individual Atma is there, and it's not one with Brahman. But it can merge in Brahman. We call it Brahma Suja. It doesn't become Brahman. It remains as it is. And therefore, to emphasize that point, sometimes it's said it's even possible, theoretically, for someone in Brahman to get association and become a devotee. Now, there is no association there, but it happens to the Jiva Muktas, Jiva Muktas who are in the penultimate stage of liberation before leaving the body, getting to the body. They're there for all intents and purposes, but not yet. It's the second to the last stage, and the last stage before entering into perfection. So they can get association. They can become devotees. It's possible. They can be pulled out of Brahman, so to speak. It doesn't happen often either. Because there's such a strong samskar for that. So.
Is the four Kumaras included with that?
Yeah, the four Kumaras. And see, now the thing is that the Sukadeva is another example. I think the Nava Yogena is perhaps in the 11th canto as well, but though the story is not told. They, in Jiva and Vishnu Chakravarti makes the point in the commentary that there are different types of jnanis, even amongst those who have as their ideal something, some form of what we call Brahma Saruja. but not all can attain it. Not those that are offensive to Bhagavan. It's the point. It's very hard not to be in the mind God. It's cool. But maybe possible. We take like Madhusudana Saraswati. Really, that's big. Advaita, and he seems to have an awful lot of love for Krishna. See the commentary, like the praises of Krishna he gives. He feels them. You wish some devotees would feel that way. Really feel that way. So it's possible. But Bhagavatam says, what? If they offend the bhakti, then we really think they're liberated. They never come over the state, they can not possible. So they can attain self-realization, as I said, but that's not realization. But here, in this case, of the reformers, if you will, who felt that God is closer to the people, and the logos, the name, it appears in chant, and anyone can chant. You don't have to be born as a Brahmin. Anyone can chant from anywhere, and so it's a revolt against this monopoly on spirituality that they take birth as a Brahmin and then take sannyas and so forth. Go direct with Nam to Nam. Still, the ideal there of transcendence is not very well articulated, and so we, and often if it is, it sounds awfully much like Brahma Sayuja, rather than Vakuntha or Goloka, such attainments of Bhagavan and eternal bhakti. So this is a difference between, big difference to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's advocacy of Nam-Dharma and that of others. He has a whole Dharma of the name and the whole theology of the name. That we have so much emphasis on Nam and have as your ideal merging in Brahman. It's just like such a pity. It's such a shallow idea of that which you're so preoccupied with that you give it up. The Gaudiya perspective, of course, is how can something material lead us to transcendence? We say Sattva-gun can help us give clarity of thought. That we may have inspiration. Then it's like going to the airport. The airport's not going to fly you out of there. You've got to get on a plane. You can hang out at the airport all you want. And there are people who do that. And, they're undesirable. They get arrested. So it's a place for going somewhere else. So virtue is to be attained for this purpose or something else. Of course, it's not that virtue or something piety, as we know, begets bhakti. That's another thing. Bhakti is descending, but nonetheless, it will touch pious people in a way that it will be different the way it touches impious people. Whose hearts are clear already by some other method, for example. Bhakti will have to be more efficacious more quickly, but it can pick up anyway and bring them to Sattva-guna and to transcendence. For someone who's already largely influenced by Sattva-guna, then obviously they're going to proceed and be able to take advantage of bhakti more readily, because her first work with Nam is to cleanse the heart. So that's what Krishna says in the Gita. The Gyanis, well, there's another perspective. They're the best. They're most dear because their hearts are pure. They have no material desire. So they take the bhakti, and then there are those who are inquisitive, those who want material things, those who want to get away from suffering. Artha Jignasura, Artha Jnani Java, and then he glorifies the Gyanis in particular. There, Vasudeva is to these types of people. So they have a likeness to him. They're spiritual. they've kind of become fire, so they're more suitable for entering the fire, if you will. So this was some of the climates of the times, and so this past that was picked out. Placed here, the Maya has been defeated, and the one and the non-dharma has been glorified. There's some scriptural statements supporting it and so forth have been brought out. And then he concludes here with a mention of the Panchatattva. He says, Ehi Panchatattva Rupe Shri Krishna Caitanya, Krishna Nam Prem Diya Vishwa Kaila Dhanya. So it's kind of a wrapping up statement that brings us back to the part of the chapter, the beginning of the chapter before the narrative. So the narrative is really over. And we're back to the beginning, which was an explanation of the Panchatattva. So this chapter is about, because the Panchatattva is involved in distributing the holy name as described in the beginning of the chapter, and that story, which Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's and Caitanya questioned and explained. So it seems appropriate. A Panchatattva Rupe Shri Krishna Chaitanya. So this five-formed Panch truth, Shri Krishna Chaitanya, Krishna Nam Prem Diya Vishwa Kaila Dhanya. Deliver the world through the chanting of the holy name. Prabhupada brings it differently. He says, Shri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's associates of Panchatattva distribute the holy name of the Lord to invoke love of God throughout the world. Oh, that's right. Yeah, so that's. And thus the entire world, universe was thankful. Yeah. So again, this takes us back to the beginning of the chapter. And there are some more here concluding verses what we did, but I want to go back to the beginning of the chapter here for a moment. And so we discuss it. We began our discussion of Chaitanya Charitamrita this year with the beginning of this narrative. So again, the chapter begins with the glorification of the Panchatattva. He begins the chapter by saying that Pule Guruvadi Chai, Tattva Kula Namaskar, Guru Tattva Kuriyachi, Eve Pancharichar. So previously I explained the Guru principle, because the first verse was Vande Guru, and Ishavakya goes on, names the Panchatattva in terms of they represent the Godhead, the expansion, the avatar, the Shakti, and the Bhakta. Right? These principles, Bhakta Tattva, Shakti Tattva, Avatar Tattva, Kash Tattva, and Bhagavan. Swami Bhagavan himself. So in that first chapter, he really spends more time on explaining Guru Tattva. So then he goes on with, of course, the verses that follow, among the verses about Chaitanya Mahaprabhu 4 or so, and 5 about Nityananda 2 about Vedanta. So he goes into it there. And now he hasn't talked about the other two, Gadadhar and Srivas, Shakti Tattva and Bhakti Tattva in any detail. So I'm going to do that briefly here, and that's what he says, more or less. Panchatattva Abhutirna Chaitanya Shangi, Panchatattva Lamkaran Sankirtana Mangi. So these 5 tattvas incarnate as kind of a one whole. He says, Panchatattva Ekavastu, Naikitu Ved. These 5 truths are one substance. Naikitu Ved. They're not different. Rasaspati Tetavu Vived, but they're Vived. They're Ved, but they're Vived. They're non-different,
but they're different. And they're different in terms of rasasmrite, tasting rasa. So the multiplicity, the variety of the spiritual world. And this is appropriate here to mention it because, of course, this is particularly the case with regard to the tattva, Shakti tattva in particular. Makes it for the variety, if you will. And now that's a nice point. It's interesting because if you look at material life, like say in modern society, if we look at matter, and we want to explain reality, what we're perceiving, and the nature of the reality, then you get to this description of protons, neutrons, atoms, quarks, gluons, all these subatomic particles, and so forth, and these quantitative descriptions of the nature of reality. Its velocity, its width, its depth, its so on and so forth. And then there's this idea of naive reality. It's a philosophical concept. Naive reality philosophically means that, well, it's not really real, but it's how we perceive everything. We see colors, but they aren't really there. They're just this, whatever, diffusion of light and rays. And our mind makes a whole something out of it that's not really there. This is the idea. Right? Turns it into something that's not there. That's called naive reality. We live in a naive reality, but the actual reality is that there's only these particles and physical stuff. Of course, there's it's obviously a big enigma in science that it's because the brain is supposed to be also physical stuff, and somehow out of it something else is coming out that's not physical. It's complicated. It's a problem for them. And they do a song and dance like my philosophers to try to explain it away, something like that. But I mean, the practical reality is that let's take, for example, let's take a joke. So you could analyze a joke. Maybe there are different degrees of wit and so on and so forth. And you look at the words and the sounds and everything like that, and you can say this is what a joke really is. But no one will laugh. It's not laughable. If the laughable doesn't come out of it, and where does the laughable? Then what's the meaning of a joke? Where does it come from? So again, I've talked about this before. What's real? The joke analyzed like that, or the rainbow. You can say that matter doesn't produce these colors to give us a show of color, but the mind is meant to see it like that. But the mind has a purpose to. So I'm just saying that this is an interesting point because we live in the so-called naive reality. We can deny it. We don't, but we can deny it philosophically from a materialistic point of view, on the basis of materialism. But we can't live it. That materialism cannot be lived. There's nothing to do there. There's nothing happening. And of course, it's something that's reasoned out. That says that there's no meaning to reason either, ultimately. So it's not anything. If a truth cannot be lived, there's no place in it for us, for experience. Then, what kind of truth is it? So you have your romanticists and you have the other, whatever they're called, on the other side. But our idea is, of course, that the experiential side of life, when we talk about mind and emotion, the mental and emotional world, is more close to ultimate reality than just the physical world. So I would say that in one sense, the naive reality is more close to actual reality.
It's an approximation. And it's experiential, although its experiential capacity is limited, being focused as it is the subtle body on physical matter. But it's more closely an approximation of the Atma, which is an experiential reality, than the physical world. And so, in fact, we say that naive reality is more real than the so-called, I don't know what the term for would be, but actual reality, physical, objective reality, in a sense. Now, when we go to Krishna Lila, it comes on the other side. So you enter into Brahman, and everything is Brahman. And it becomes, from a spiritual perspective, as bad as everything is atoms. It's still, in that, and when we have Lila, this is the naive reality of the spiritual world, and Krishna Lila, and this is Rasa Smriti. There's a difference, and we tend to emphasize the difference side. Parakia is an illusion, right? It's a, the physical world is like a skeleton, and we dress it with our imagination. It's decorated and turn it into something other than what it is. That's an illusion. And there's some truth to that, but as I'm explaining, there's no life in that worldview. Ultimately, you can't live in that world. We live in a different world. So there's no spiritual life, in a sense, in Brahman. There's a spiritual something, but there's nothing that resembles life, movement, exchange, feeling, differentiation, and so on and so forth. So Krishna Lila is the naive reality of the spiritual world, and Krishna himself is absorbed in it. It's livable, and therefore more desirable. So everything belongs to Krishna. There is no parakia. That's an illusion, but it's one that gives the most pleasure to Krishna. So some siddhi of Harigoshna, it's the fullest form of Dharma, as much as Dharma is truth or the right thing to do. So Dharma is evaluated on a scale, the extent to which it pleases Krishna. This looks like adharma. It looks like something doesn't belong to Krishna, but he's stealing it. You own everything, and then what you steal, that's called a play, and it's giving him pleasure, and so it has value, and more value, because it's pleasing to him, than the tattva perspective. We need both, obviously, but just to make the point. So, in this way, he goes on, and now he cites his verse, Panchatattva, Krishna, Bhakti, Rupa, Surupakam, Bhakta, Bhakta, Namami, Bhakti. Shaktikam, he glorifies the 5 principles, minus Guru principle, which he included in his own verse, and then he'll stress the 2 here that haven't been discussed directly. I mean, he couldn't discuss Bhagavan Shri Krishna and Caitanya Mahaprabhu without discussing Radha. So obviously, this Rup Shakti is there in that way. Shakti Tattva. He has explained it, and but here he's going into it, directly, but very, very briefly. The extent to which he's talked about the 3 Prabhus, and 2 Prabhus and 1 Mahaprabhu, the Lords, is considerable in relation to his mention of the Shakti Tattva and the Bhakta Tattva, well, Vaishnava Tattva. And that's to say there's a big difference in one sense. So he says Swami Bhagavan Krishna Ekal Ishvar. So he's one, Krishna, Swami Bhagavan. Aditya Nam Nandatmaja Rasika Shekhar. So without a second, he is the Nandatmaja, the son of Nanda Maharaj, and the Rasika Shekhar, the enjoyer of the prince of rasa, taste of rasa. Rasadi Vilasi Braja Lalana Nagar Ajata Shabdeka Tanur Purikar. Sri Krishna is the supreme enjoyer of the rasa dance, leader of the damsels of Braja. And all others are simply his associates. Sri Krishna Vatyana, Sri Krishna Caitanya, say Parikar Gan Shange Sabdani. So saying Krishna advented himself as Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. These eternal associates were also equally glorious. Ekalishwar Tattva Chaitanyashwar Bhakta Bhavamai Tamna Shuddha Bhakkalivar. His body is transcendental. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is the one personality of Godhead, and is him becoming a devotee in a transcendental body. Krishna Madhurya Eka Adbhuta Shabhav Apana Ashpurite Krishna Kori Bhakta Bhav. Transcendental mellow of Madhurasa, Krishna Madhurya, is so wonderful that Krishna himself accepts the form of the devotee to taste it. Iti Bhakta Bhav Hare Chaitanya Gosai Bhakta Swarup Tamanityanandavai. For this reason, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the supreme teacher, accepts the form of a devotee and accepts Nityananda as his elder brother. Bhagavatar Tanva Acharya Gosai Itim Chat Pushopte Prabhu Kodikar. So, and Shri Advaita is the Lord's incarnation as a devotee. These three tattvas are the masters. Ek Mahaprabhu, Har Prabhu Dujan. There's one Mahaprabhu and two Prabhus. One great teacher and Lord, and two good ones. Dui Prabhu Sebe Mahaprabhu Charan. So one Mahaprabhu is worshipped, his feet are worshipped by the other two. The three predominators are then these lords are worshipable by all living entities. And the fourth principle is also understood to be their worshipper. Shivasadi Jata Koti Koti Bhaktagram Shuru Bhakta Tattva Madhya Tan Savagam. There are innumerable devotees, the Lord headed by Srivas Thakur. There are known as Shuddha Bhaktas, and they are Tattva Madhya. Tattva Madhya, so they're middle tattva. And Ganadhar Panditati Prabhu, Shakti Avatar, Antaranga Bhakta Kuri, Ghananam Chamthar. And then there are those who are headed by Gadadhar, those devotees, I mentioned the Mad Tattva Madhya, Shuddha Bhaktas, they're headed by Srivas, Adi, and the others. And then there are those like Gadadhar Panditati, Prabhu Shakti Avatar. They are Shakti avatars, means they are manifestations of the Swarup Shakti, Antaranga Bhakta, he calls that. Instead of Tattva Madhya, Antaranga Bhaktas. So these are the two types. And with them, he says, they go, they propound the Sankirtan, they plunder the storehouse of love of God.
to distribute it, even though they distribute it, the supply doesn't run out, such is its nature. This is their idea to inundate the whole world with love of God, not let anybody escape. And that's why Chaitanya Mahaprabhu took sannyas in particular, so that no one could escape, because some people weren't understanding him, and amongst them, the chief group is the Mayavadis, going to segue us into the narrative of converting the Mayavadis as an example of the power of the Panchatattva to convert even those against and offending by nature, the very practice, the very ideal that they come to share. So this is his brief description of the Panchatattva in this chapter. And of course, there's the 5 principles. They should be understood, but they go together. Well, Sri Krishna is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, that's pretty well understood. The person of Nityananda Prabhu is the Prakash. The Prakash represents the truth about Chaitanya's dispensation, that there is a world of variety and varieties of light of God. Nityananda Prabhu came with his own associates. That's significant. He comes from there, and he comes with his own group. For example, the Dwadasa Gopals. So he represents another possibility, of which there are many in the spiritual world, of different rasas. So you need expansions of Krishna that are slightly different in emotional composition, in order for there to be a very spiritual world of different sentiments. Krishna alone is the object of love, but to facilitate the playing out of different sentiments, he appears as Balaram and expands as Narayan, for example, and Vaikuntha, forearm for accepting reverential love, and so forth. So this is the Prakash. Prakash is different than the Avatar, because the Prakash means expansions in the Paravyom, in the spiritual world. And Nityananda is obviously represents this, because he comes from there, and he comes with his own associates to emphasize the point that there are other sentiments, and it's a variegated place. And while we have one main theme there, for example, unification of Radha and Krishna in Vrindavan, the supporting roles are necessary in order for that to happen. The example is there. It's a nice example. When Krishna went to Kurukshetra and the gopis met him, and they had it out, so to speak, why he left, and where have you been, and how did you do this to us, and he tries to explain himself and so forth. He said, well, anyway, I'm here now, so let's go. I can take you to Dwarka, and you can all be, with me there, and so forth. And that's not going to work for us. There's no non. What of your father, your mother, your friends, and the cows, and the Yamuna and Govardhan, all these things, without these things. These are all necessary ingredients, and for the Parakiya. There'll be no Parakiya. It's notable that in the Gopal Champu, which is a book that ostensibly argues for Swakiya in the part of Yom, that twice the verse that Mahaprabhu chanted in the Rath Yatra is cited, which is an aspiration at Kurukshetra on the part of Radharani, the Parakiya. I want you in that situation, along the banks of the Jamuna. And Goswami wrote a verse to explain it. Parakiya requires all these things. So this is to explain the Parakiya. This part is also necessary. So Nityananda is the Prakash. He's the primary Prakash, the original expansion of the Lord. Body is non-different, but the emotional composition is slightly different, and complexion, and so on and so forth. Corresponding complexion. So Nityananda. So these are the five. He's explaining the 5 truths. They're a composite
of what Caitanya Mahaprabhu came to give. If he came to give the Parki of Bhava, for example, primarily, then this has to be explained too. And there may be a byproduct of that some people follow into non-divorce we see and develop affinity for that and enter into a supportive role, for example. Fine. But even to distribute the Parki and make it understood and so forth, this is necessary. So you say, okay, so he came for this, taste this himself, experience this, these other ingredients are necessary. So you need the prakash. And then there's the avatar. Advaita represents the avatar because he brought Chaitanya Mahaprabhu here with the view to see Nam Sankirtan widely disseminated, which is the Yuga Dharma in Kali Yuga, and the Yuga Avatar comes from the Mahavishnu. He's the original avatar. He's the first avatar. Narayan has a desire to bestow mukti. He cannot bestow mukti upon muktas. So a world, corresponding world in jivas, other jivas in need of mukti manifest in the person of Mahavishnu, who's the first avatar, his expansion. And then all the different avatars come through him. So because Advaita called him for the purpose of Nam Sankirtan, and who did he worship? Worship the Shaligram. Narayan. Simply, of course, from the bank of the Ganges with water and tulsi leaves and with a fervent prayer for Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to come for a specific purpose. That's clearly what he was seeking. He himself was a leader of Sankirtan, and it wasn't real popular. And so he was seeking some help. But the principle of the avatar is personified in him, which means the beneficent, descent of the Godhead in the world to establish the Dharma, to liberate the people. One becomes many, and many are in trouble because they're small in relation to his jurisdiction, which is over the Maya Shakti. So he tries to remedy the situation that the many can meet their maker, principle of avatar, and the two sides to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So, right, you want to distribute bhakti, Nam Sankirtan, and the inner side to experience love of God. And because the two came together in a certain way, then the way in which he distributes also is extraordinary. And with the Nam Dharma, they can get bhakti instead of Bhakti bhakti. But in order for all this to happen, you need the descent. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu also is descending, he's the avatari. Chaitanya was coming because Chaitanya Mahaprabhu comes. So wherever Mahaprabhu comes, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is following. But the way the personifies or represents the principle of the avatar. Mahaprabhu came through him for Yuga Dharma. And then you have Gadadhar Pandit. He's mentioned last, I guess. That depends how you say it. So you have Gadadhar Pandit, and he represents the internal Shakti. And you see, he doesn't take outwardly a prominent role like Nityananda Prabhu or Advaita Prabhu. He takes more of a background role, which is the case for Radha. And we put her in the front, but she tends to put herself in the background and praise Krishna. And she is the dancing of Radha is said to be the guru of Krishna. This is a very, very subtle, very beautiful sense, but in a covert way. So Gadadhar is covertly, so to speak, a guru of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is coming to the world to experience the love of Radha And Radha knows this is going to be a problem for him. He will crash to the ground and perspire blood and all these shocking ecstasies, all 8 full ecstasies appearing in most extreme blazing form, likes of which there's no other example. And so Gadadhar has this kind of protective role from childhood, such enough to put him in charge of, go with him, protect him from himself and so forth. So he's there like a shadow, which is, this is his function in one sense in the Guru and the teacher of the Bhagavad, the Pandit of the Bhagavad discourse, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu would listen. So he represents the Shakti Tattva, the Antaranga Shakti. And then the Srivas is singled out, and all the devotees who represent the Tasta Shakti, really under the influence of the Srup Shakti, but they remain as the Tasta Shakti. And that's what we call a devotee. That's the typical Monday in the middle, they can go inside, right? We have the worldly naive reality, or we could have the Krishna Lila naive reality by the influence of the Antaranga Shakti. We have that capacity. So this is the Panchatattva. So you need Bhagavan, you need the expansion, you need the avatar principle, you need yourself, who needs to receive the gift, and you need the gift. The gift is bhakti. These are the Panchatattva. You need all the 5 of these things. This is the dispensation of Mahaprabhu. You need the devotee who gets to be blessed, benedicted. You need the benediction, which is bhakti, and you need the avatar to get them to come on down and do that, and so forth. And you need Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself, and you need to understand the variegated nature of the Lila, and the fact that such possibilities, something like that. This is the Panchatattva. They all are all one. They come for one purpose. Much to be learned from that. Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita ki jai, Panchatattva ki jai, Shri Shambhu Radha Madhava ki jai, Bhakta Vrinda ki jai, Lord Premanand.
Divine Grace Tripurari Swami Guru Maharaj ki jai. See, how can you give classes like that and not ask questions?
We're going to ask questions tomorrow.
I'm just teasing you.